to our Labor and Work-Life Forum. I hope you did not wear your Nike shoes. Maybe you did or did not buy a Barbie doll recently, and you were careful in what you were drinking last night as you were having your dinner. I wore a Canadian-made jacket, which I assume was made by good labor, and American-made shoes, but I didn't quite check my T-shirt and my underwear, so I don't know. But today, we're going to have a Naomi Klein, who's the author of this book, No Logo, which is about the corporate global branding and all the various things we can or cannot do and the things that are being done to make sure that if we're buying Nike, they really are good guys rather than bad guys. I assume Alfred Knopf and Company is a good guy, so they're bringing out this book. She's also just recently had a piece in the New York Times expressing sympathy with a bunch of anti-WTO protests in Seattle, which will be counter to everything you've heard from all the economists in the group, and therefore is probably will please you no end. Naomi, the floor is yours, or the podium is yours.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Elaine Bernard and Jack Trumper and Jeff Ballinger, who are all responsible for inviting me here today. It's a great honor. A couple of months ago, I got an email from someone who I just met, and he said, you know, when you told me that you had just written a book about anti-corporate activism, I was only pretending to know what on earth you were talking about. Then I went home and I turned on the television set and saw what was going on in Seattle, and I realized what you were talking about. At the time, critics accused the anti-WTO protesters in Seattle of ignorance, of coming together in a jumble of unrelated slogans that degenerated into petty vandalism. What I want to argue today is that that's not true at all, that there was a common cause in Seattle, and that was that the multinational corporation has been identified as the root cause of the degradation of labor standards, human rights, and environmental standards. Even when the protests degenerated into rioting, the targets of their rage were still coherent, if crudely expressed. McDonald's, The Gap, Levi's, Starbucks. I believe that behind the protests outside of Nike Town, behind the pie in Bill Gates's face, behind the bottle shattering at those McDonald's windows in Seattle, and even behind the attacks on those e-commerce sites on the internet, there is something too visceral for most conventional measures to track, a kind of bad mood rising against the global brands. The windows that shattered in Seattle weren't just any windows. They were symbolic windows, windows opening onto the new economy. That was what was under attack. And behind the shattering glass, we are also seeing the beginnings of a new agenda, the need for enforceable regulations governing labor, environmental, and human rights standards in the global economy. The need to rein in corporate power on the global level so that corporations are ruled by citizens rather than the other way around. The questions I want to answer today is why now? Because of course, labor, environmental, and human rights violations are not new. Why then are they drawing people to the streets in the thousands all of a sudden? The answer has to do with an ideology that has gripped the corporate world over the past 15 years and has sent it into euphoric convulsions in the age of e-commerce. That is the idea that in order to be a successful multinational corporations, you need to produce brands, not products. The idea is that anyone can produce a product in the global economy. And look at what happened to IBM when it almost went under in the late 80s. Competing based on value is a loser's game, they say. The market was flooded with identical PCs, and IBM did not have a strong enough brand to compete. Of course, we know today that IBM has reincarnated itself into being about solutions, no longer about these clunky machines. It is about the global economy itself. In this context of hostility towards products, the brand has evolved from a mark of quality on a product to a badge of courage for the consumer. Nike is the most popular tattoo in North America. the Nike swoosh, that is. In this corporate formula, the brand has little to do with the product. Rather, it is a freestanding idea. The goal of the successful brand has become nothing short of transcendence from the world of things. So we've had these series of corporate epiphanies in the past 15 years. Nike, we are told, is no longer a shoe company, it is a sports company. It is about the idea of transcendence through sports. Starbucks, we are told, is not a coffee company. It is a community company. Diesel is about creating a movement. Microsoft is not about software, it is about communication. The product becomes a medium to express the brand's idea, and it is one medium among many, like a billboard. And as we know, as these companies have transcended, they have in many cases stopped producing their own products entirely. And there's been an interesting parallel with other brands, the rise of celebrity super brands. As corporations like Nike and Starbucks have occupied the role of celebrities in our culture, the celebrities in our culture are increasingly envisioning themselves as corporations, as brands. So we have the Martha Stewarts, the Michael Jordans, the Jerry Seinfelds. But what's really interesting is that increasingly, just as Nike has stopped producing its own sneakers, many of these super branded humans have also begun to separate themselves from anything that could broadly be described as doing things. We have Michael Jordan, who has transcended the need to play basketball, just as Nike has transcended the need to make running shoes. And he has become a pure brand. He is about the Jordan attitude, and in fact has become the first celebrity endorser to have his own celebrity endorsers. We have Wayne Gretzky, very similar, stopped playing hockey so that he can be a full-time brand. Jerry Seinfeld gave up the sitcom, why bother? And what's really interesting is, of course, we know that the true celebrities of our branded era are not the basketball stars or the running shoes, but the CEOs themselves. And I was very interested to learn that Bill Gates had stepped down as CEO of Microsoft. He too has transcended to become pure brand. He is pure Bill. Of course, the end result of this type of branding economy is seen not in the corporeal world of things, but online, in the IPOs, the Netscapes and Amazon.coms. The ultimate transcendence is, of course, occurring on the internet. These companies exist as ideas of themselves, free from products entirely. It's tempting to dismiss branding mania as a flavor of the week, just a little bit more management babble. What I'm arguing here is that this seemingly innocuous idea has had two major effects on our culture, transformative effects, which taken together explain the rise of anti-corporate activism that we saw in Seattle. And these two effects I'll separate into two categories: no space and no jobs. The brand needs to express its idea. How does it do that? It needs to project itself onto as many surfaces as possible. That is how a company that is about an idea, not a product, becomes real. Through sponsorship of cultural events, by launching its own lifestyle magazine, in the case of Starbucks, or a line of furniture, in the case of Ernest Hemingway, by building palatial superstores, in the case of everyone, through new and exciting brand extensions. If you think of the brand as a balloon with nothing much at the center, because of course the product has magically disappeared, this process of absorbing cultural space is how it staves off its own deflation. Everything is a tableau for the brand, and the brand needs to write on these surfaces in order to exist. Advertising agencies have started to think of themselves not as marketers, but as brand factories. In fact, there is an advertising firm in my hometown of Toronto that is called the Brand Factories. And in fact, this is the true production of our information economy. We've seen the rise of the cool hunting industry, which didn't exist before 1993 and is now a ballooning industry. The role of this industry is to comb our culture, comb the back alleys, our schools, our playing fields, and find content for the brands to make them real. Find precious ideas, heroes, political movements, and sell them back to the brands. I want to stress that this process is not about advertising. It is about production. The goal is no longer association, but merger with the culture. Advertising used to be about associating a product with a particular lifestyle, with a particular aspirational quality, such as beauty. What we're seeing now are 3D ads that are so all-encompassing, they cease to be advertisements at all and become our culture. Nike, for instance, once it decided that it was about sports, was not satisfied with simply attaching its name to sporting events. It has started buying sporting events outright. Roots, a Canadian company which has the brand meaning of summer camp, the Canadian wilderness, has built a summer camp, a branded summer camp, which you can visit for any length of time, and where you are completely cocooned in the Roots brand. Everything is owned by Roots. Mentos used to try to associate itself with rock music. It now owns the Mentos Freshmaker Tour. Swatch, whose brand is time, not watches, has launched its own time. It's called Internet Time, and it's branded time, and it divides the day into Swatch beats. Benetton, of course, has become a campaigner for death row inmates. It is about a political movement. The goal of branding is seamless integration with their brand idea, becoming real-world incarnations of their myth. The brand is the cultural infrastructure. The culture is brand content. Now, of course, within this new culture, a kind of global claustrophobia sets in for many people. Cool hunting, of course, is a form of legalized mass stalking. Students are enlisted as self-marketers more and more. They are given disposable cameras and journals to keep track of their friends' haircuts and so on, and the latest lingo to sell it to the brand masters. What this means is that there's no gestation period for new scenes, for new ideas. And I think as a young person, you're faced with a couple of choices. One is that you can turn yourself into a commodity, become what Tom Peters calls a brand called you, a professional consumer, and sell that information at a premium to your corporate clients. Or you can do something else. You can begin to run in the other direction. I said that branding is about transcending products. But what does that really mean? It means that products, more specifically, the people who produce those products, have just gotten a very major demotion in the economic hierarchy. Because in this equation, products are banal, whereas branding is what is exciting. But branding is an enormously expensive enterprise, getting more expensive every day. The money needs to be saved somewhere to fuel these ambitious corporate utopias, the Nike Towns, the Roots Lodges, the Swatch Times. Where it's being saved is in the act of production. Companies that used to be satisfied with 100% markup from what it cost to produce their product to what they would sell it at retail are now not settling for nothing less than 400%. The idea is that you can let someone else produce your product, and you will buy the product, source them like a raw commodity. Better yet, get lots of other people to produce your products and have them compete against each other over who can give you the best price. After all, what you produce is not the product, but the image, the brand. This is the Nike paradigm. Don't own a single factory, and let a web of contractors and subcontractors around the world fall over each other to offer to make your shoes at the cheapest price. The reason why Nike is so significant is because they have spawned armies of copycats. Levi Strauss laid off 13,000 workers in the past 3 years. But when they laid off those workers, it was reported in the news as if, once again, some American factories closed, they moved to Mexico, they moved to China, but of course that's not what happened at all. Those factories that were closed in El Paso, Texas, were never reopened. They turned into something else in the branding economy. They turned into contracts to be placed with contractors. Levi's would never own those factories again. They would be produced for the most part in free trade zones. $250 billion worth of trade flows through these zones, often called maquiladoras or export processing zones, every day. Now, I don't think I need to tell anybody in this room what a free trade zone is. We've all heard the horror stories from Mexico, Indonesia, Honduras, and China, the 12 and 16-hour days, the forced overtime, the cramped dorm rooms, and the poverty wages. What I'm arguing, however, is that these horrid conditions that have become the cliches of our global economy are a byproduct of the branding equation. And we might clean it up a little bit, but the basic structure remains the same. Work is being degraded by the obsession with marketing. And increasingly, those concerned with labor cannot afford to ignore the mechanics of branding because they are interrelated. Levi Strauss can write a wonderful code of conduct, and it can even enforce that code of conduct with some of its contractors. But when it shut down those factories, it made a decision to make production a less central part of its corporation, and therefore play a more marginal role in the economy. Production work is being marginalized in this way throughout the economy, and that is why these abuses are occurring in a systemic way. A similar degradation of work is, of course, occurring not just in the factories, but at the North American and European mall, occurring at the service sector end of the equation for many of the same companies, the Gap, Nike, Starbucks, McDonald's. The so-called McWork sector has pioneered a new kind of labor. The idea is that this is work that doesn't really matter. Disposable, temporary work, which is interesting because when I interviewed factory managers in the Philippines and in Indonesia, they often told me that the women who were making the shoes and the sweaters were just kids. They were just earning a little bit of money to send home to their families. The same idea, the same rhetoric. I don't think that you can compare the conditions of working at the mall to working in the export processing zone. In fact, it's obscene to do so. But from the perspective of the corporate employer, there is an undeniable symmetry at work, because at no point during the economic equation, whether it's at the production end or the service end, does a company like the Gap or Walmart ever have to confront the reality that workers with families are supporting themselves on their jobs, on the wages they pay. The two largest employers in America, as you all know, are Walmart, which defines full-time as 28 hours a week, and Manpower, Inc., the largest temp service agency in the world. Microsoft. You know, it's interesting when you talk about McJobs and sweatshops, people always say, well, what about Silicon Valley? What about Silicon Gold? Isn't that where the good jobs are? And of course, Microsoft has been the one to perpetuate in many ways the myth of Silicon Gold. And in fact, there was a time when it was true. But today, Microsoft keeps between 4,000 and 6,000 of its workers, more than a third of its entire workforce, classified as temps. At Microsoft, they call themselves permatemps, because many of them have been working at the company for years, and they work side by side with employees who are performing the exact same tasks as them, but of course they have stock options and security and benefits. Microsoft has outsourced so many of its departments to temp agencies, outsourced them in their entirety, that they had to hire a temp agency to manage all of their temp agencies. They said, you know, we can't do it, that's not one of our core competencies. So we're seeing a class system emerge, a class system not just between first and third world, not just a class system in the growing disparity within countries, but even a class system within individual companies like Microsoft. And I think that there is an interesting relationship with the branding economy that I spoke of earlier in terms of marketing, because everywhere the same brands that have aggressively sought to weave their way into our culture in these quasi-spiritual ways are attempting to opt out in these very concrete ways as full-time steady employers. So you have these companies, the Nikes, the Starbucks, the McDonald's, that are at once culturally omnipresent and economically disengaged, like phantoms floating over the economy. The effect of this is that brands are courting backlash. There is nothing in their New Deal with workers, as employers of temps, part-timers, and contractors, that is going to protect them from the kind of public rage that we saw in Seattle. Well, I had the opportunity to visit a Nike factory when I was in the Philippines at closing time, and I watched the workers line up at the gate and open their bags for bag check. They were being searched by military guards. And as I was watching this, I saw I thought about what it was like to go to a North American mall at closing time and to watch all of the so-called MIC workers at the Gap and Benetton open up their bags for their managers for bag check. It's a ritual at the mall. It happens every day. And once again, you know, this is not the same situation. The workers at the mall are not being searched by guards with submachine guns. But the assumption is the same. The assumption is that given half a chance, of course, these workers would rob their employer blind. Which brings us back to Seattle and that shattering glass. I think that when the mechanics of no space and the reality of no jobs are taken together, you get what I call no logo, the rise of anti-corporate activism. And as I mentioned, I think we're seeing a little bit with these attacks on the e-commerce sites, the largest e-commerce sites on the net. A couple of years ago, the internet was still approximating a public commons, but there has been a virtual coup d'etat in just about 2 years. And I think that it's that coup d'etat, this virtual coup d'etat, that has provoked these attacks. I think we're also seeing the seeds of this rage in the campaign that targeted McDonald's in England, the so-called McLibel trial, the longest civil trial in British history, where 2 British environmentalists who were sued for libel turned the tables on McDonald's and put the corporation on trial for basically crimes against humanity. I think we've seen it in the way Nike and The Gap and Disney and Kathy Lee Gifford have all become symbols for sweatshop labor to varying degrees. That labor activists have made a concerted decision to target the most visible, the most polished brands on the brandscape and use the power of branding against itself. I think we've seen some of these tactics in the campaign against Shell Oil on the Niger Delta. It was because Ken Saro-Wiwa and his colleagues were willing to name Shell as the force behind the Nigerian dictatorship and their oppression that campaign drew international attention. I think we're also seeing it in the campaign against genetically modified and engineered foods with the targeting of Monsanto and the targeting of particularly of brand name food companies, because even though Monsanto isn't itself a brand, although I should say that Monsanto is about to launch a line of branded foods, when campaigners couldn't get the attention of Monsanto, what they started to do is target brand name supermarket, brand names like Nestle and Cadbury, and because of that, they got change from Monsanto, and Monsanto agreed not to launch its controversial Terminator technology, which would have made which would have made seeds infertile after 1 year. People often make the mistake of viewing these campaigns as mere consumer boycotts, which are simply promoting ethical consumption. Basically glorified shopping guides, don't buy Nike, buy New Balance, and so on. What I'm arguing is that these are not consumer campaigns. These are political campaigns that are using corporations as political tools to achieve political gains. All over the world, citizens are fighting these macro battles against sweatshops, against genetic engineering, against human rights abuses, against monopoly in the infotech industries. And they're doing it by focusing in on 1 or 2 large brand name corporations because it's a very effective tactic. The best tool of these campaigns, funnily enough, is the logic of branding itself. We have become a culture of facades, and activists are deliberately creating sharp juxtapositions between production and brand image. One thinks of the Indonesian Nike worker sponsored by American unions going to Nike Town with cameras in tow and capturing that moment when she sees that the shoes that she produced for $2 a day are selling for $120 at Nike Town. One thinks of the efforts of the National Labor Committee to use Kathy Lee Gifford's image as the TV mom and juxtapose that with the reality of child labor. I'm thinking of a Rage Against the Machine video that's airing on MTV at the moment, which begins with a lineup of figures hunched over sewing machines, and then cuts to the slogan, "Everybody in Denial," playing, of course, on the Everybody in Khakis theme. More and more, what activists are doing is pelting the brand facade with the reality of production. The effectiveness of these tactics has to do with the arrogance of branding itself. The seeds of discontent are part of its very DNA. Because once a company decides that its true product is its image, not its product, it becomes enormously vulnerable to these semiotic terror tactics. A corporate brand balloon, after all, is by its very nature filled with hot air. I think Seattle itself was a kind of giant culture jam. If we think about the images that Seattle left us with, police dressed up in riot gear protecting Nike Town or a Starbucks outlet, French farmers handing out Roquefort cheese outside of a McDonald's, labor activists hanging a 500-foot anti-sweatshop banner on the side of an Old Navy store, a topless protester pictured in Newsweek with better naked than Nike scrawled on her back. But this is about much more than playing games with imagery. The rallying cry of the student anti-sweatshop movement has become disclosure. The seemingly innocuous demand that brand name companies like Champion, JanSport, and Nike provide universities with a list of all the contract factories that produce their goods. When several companies complied with this on January 1st, it was a major victory, not only because having these names will increase direct communication between students and workers, but also because it chips away at the distance these companies have so successfully placed between their brand image and their sites of production. It pulls the brand balloons a little closer to the ground. I have found that there is a clear connection between the branding ambition of these companies and the companies that are being targeted by these campaigns. In a sense, the more inflated the brand balloon, the more likely it is to have bred armies of pin-wielding critics anxious to watch the brand balloon fall to the ground. Phil Knight, well before Nike had become a symbol for sweatshop labor, as Phil Knight has admitted himself, said, "Somehow the emotions we create imply their opposites." And I think that was a prescient remark. Because as a culture, we have a very deeply ambivalent relationship with the brands that have so aggressively enveloped our public spaces. And so it is the brands that are most entwined with our culture that are getting hit the hardest. It's the Nikes, it's the Starbucks, it's the Microsofts, the Gaps, and even on university campuses, one's own school insignia. Some of the most successful anti-corporate campaigns have begun with a brand's aggressive sponsorship or partnership in the school system. The best example of this is Pepsi, a company which has in many ways pioneered the branding of education with a wave of exclusive vending deals inked in the early 90s with high schools and university campuses. They would be the sole distributor of soft drinks on campus. They would also get to pass out Pepsi Achievement Awards in high schools and get ads in the halls. The idea was that they would beat out Coke in the brand wars by getting at the target market, Generation Next as they call it, when they don't have a choice. But because Pepsi was the first corporation in many ways to really truly break the brand barrier to get into the schools, it also sparked its own backlash. In 1993, students at some Canadian universities were upset about the fact that their school had signed one of these exclusive deals. So they started doing some research. They didn't know what they would find, but what they found was that there was a little-known boycott that had been called against Pepsi, and it had to do with the fact that Pepsi was doing business with Burma. They started out being interested in this issue because they were concerned about corporatization, they were concerned about being over-marketed to and over-branded, and it led them to this human rights concern. Pretty soon, "Gotta Boycott" stickers were finding their way onto textbooks and onto lockers. It was a case of reverse branding. Pepsi had tried to brand these students, and now these students were turning Pepsi into their poster child for the Free Burma movement. The campaign spread to schools in Britain and to the US, and the decisive moment in the campaign happened right here. In April 1996, Harvard rejected a $1 million vending deal with Pepsi, and they cited as their reason the company's holdings in Burma. The issue made the New York Times, and then it was raised at a shareholder meeting, and pretty soon Pepsi pulled out of Burma. It had a domino effect, sparking dozens of other companies to withdraw, including Levi's, Liz Claiborne, Heineken, and the list goes on. The Pepsi campaign had the thrill of the brand boomerang. It's the same thrill, I think, that students experience when they target Nike for sweatshop abuses after their entire athletics program has been branded by the swoosh. No company has branded this generation like Nike has. And I think that given the opportunity to brand Nike back, it's just too good to resist. I think it's interesting that students have not always played such an enlightened role in these types of issues. During the infamous 1912 sweatshop strike at Lawrence Mill, not far from here, Harvard students received class credit if they agreed to serve in the militia against the striking textile workers, and many of them did. That was 1912. Now students are leading the fight against sweatshops, and corporate logos are providing the infrastructure for their global movement. Where a previous generation was entreated to follow the money, this generation of activists is following the logo. From their college sweatshirt to the sweatshops of Honduras, from the swooshes on their school gymnasium floor to the factories of Indonesia, from their Starbucks lattes to the sun-scorched fields of Guatemala. Being a target market for every powerful brand on the planet means having a direct personal connection to other young people who make the clothes, who pick the coffee, who grow the genetically modified corn all around the world. There are many other levers besides the university being used to extract corporate responsibility from brands. There's shareholder pressure, for one. There's also municipal and state governments who are deciding not to enter into large contracts with companies who use sweatshop labor or who are doing business with repressive regimes like Burma. Here in Cambridge, the City Council has a so-called selective purchasing agreement which states that it will not enter into contracts with any company invested in Burma. And at the state level, as you all know, there's the controversial Massachusetts Burma law, which has upped the stakes in this grassroots selective purchasing movement to such a degree that the international business community has rallied to defeat the law both in the U.S. courts and at the World Trade Organization. I talked briefly about how activists are dealing with applying pressure to companies that are in fact not brand-based. We talked about Monsanto. There's many other examples of this. Even raw resources turn into brands eventually. And there was just a recent victory when Home Depot agreed that they would not carry old-growth wood after the year 2002. And this is after many years of pressuring logging companies, which of course have no brand image to worry about. The logging companies were entirely unconcerned. It wasn't until they targeted their brand name consumers, the Home Depots, that they finally got their attention. Of course, this issue is far from resolved. It's easy to be seduced by these success stories, to believe, as Harvard professor Deborah Spar has suggested, that through this activist spotlight phenomenon, corporations are becoming voluntarily shamed into responsible corporate citizenship, that ethics has become the third bottom line. It would be wonderful if that was the case, but the truth is that these victories are haphazard and piecemeal. The real success stories has been the success of organizing and education. Organizers and educators, many of whom are in this room, have put these global injustices onto the political agenda. But that does not mean that real change has taken place. In fact, the pace of change, to quote Jeff Ballinger, has been glacial. That is why Seattle was so significant. It was the next step, creating a bridge from these single-issue corporate campaigns to a broader, more structural critique of the regulatory bodies that are playing referee in this race to the bottom. It's also why the student rejection of corporate-controlled codes of conduct on the sweatshop issue is so very significant, because it means that students are not falling for the easy PR solutions offered by multinationals and are instead returning to basic principles of self-determination. I'm heartened by the student-driven Workers' Rights Consortium as an alternative model to the White House's Fair Labor Association. First of all, of course, it means that students are going to be in direct communication with workers, which is crucial. But I think it's also encouraging because what these campaigns are really about is not a battle over which brand is more ethical. It's a classic power struggle. It's a struggle over who is going to write the rules for our global economy. Will it be citizens, workers, and their democratic institutions, or will it be corporations and their trade organizations? Will labor rights, in fact, be branded? When students organize themselves to write meaningful codes of conduct for their school's business partners, they're doing more than making sure that their sweatshirts and baseball hats are made under ethical conditions. They're practicing writing democratic rules for the global economy, laying the intellectual framework for a global New Deal. Students, in other words, are teaching themselves how to regulate global corporations. If there is a more crucial skill one can get out of post-secondary education, I'd certainly like to hear about it. Thank you very much for listening.
The floor is open for discussion. You can take it.
Okay. All right. So I'm just going to take questions for the next little while.
You made a distinction between boycotts and political movements and suggested this was more about political movements, and yet most of the examples I heard you citing were about actions, well, I think all of them, against companies. And I just wondered what you thought would be a more effective tool in this fight would be to continue the battle against companies, which you say is moving at a glacial pace, or actually move against governments. And some people say that governments have no power in this era of globalization. Others would argue against that. That's one question. Can I sneak in another before I stop? The whole idea of branding as culture, I'm wondering what that means, or if you've thought about what it means to institutions that have long existed simply because of culture, that are cultural institutions. What kind of effect does this have on those?
I'll take the first one first. I certainly do go into that at great length in the book. And there's obviously a corresponding relationship with the rise of these sort of pseudo-public branded spaces like the Nike towns, and what's interesting about the superstores in particular is that they all use the language of the public sphere. Like they're the town square, it's the third meeting place, and so on. And so this is a process of replacing the public sphere. And I think you see that, in a truly Orwellian form in a case like Celebration, Florida, owned by Disney, a fully privatized town. And of course, the growth of the corporate sponsorship industry, which has grown by 700% since 1985 in the U.S., has corresponded to a decline of the public sector. So it is a true competition, and it's a competition on a sort of macro political level where you see the starving out of the public sector by corporations paying less corporate tax, but then it's also a war, sort of a power struggle on the micro level of an individual arts event where, say, it starts off with a logo in the corner and suddenly the entire event has been privatized and artists are sort of playing an opening act for the logo, which is the true star. And I have lots of examples of that in the book. The issue of whether this is going after corporations is effective or whether it's more effective to go after governments. What I'm talking about with Seattle is that I believe that Seattle does mark a shift in the U.S., and I think that shift has been happening in other countries before Seattle, with protests outside of APEC, outside of G7, G8 summits, and that activists are more and more going after the global regulatory bodies and pressuring their own governments, and that is so that they're not entirely abandoning governments. The selective purchasing is a government response. It's municipal and state governments responding, where the federal governments have stepped aside and said that they don't want to attach any sorts of regulations to trade. But more importantly, I think that the reason why these corporate campaigns are interesting to look at is because they are opening the door to the global economy, that essentially everything about this discussion is structured to make individuals feel that they need a degree in international law to even participate in the discussion, that it's enormously alienating. Everybody feels that they were sick the day everybody else learned what the OECD stood for, and that what I'm finding, particularly for young people, is that they're learning about Nike, and they're learning about Nike as a metaphor for the global economy gone awry. They can get their head around, Michael Jordan makes $20 million, Indonesian workforce could have their lives changed with that much money. And through this sort of popular education project of using the brands as popular education tools, we are finding our way into this very arcane, exclusive arena. And of course, we're not wanted there at all, as the pepper spray and tear gas shows.
In your book, you discuss how the number of the part-time U.S. employees it has tripled since 1968, and the hamburger flipping service sector led by McDonald's is responsible for a significant portion of this growth in part-time work. You mentioned how McDonald's been embroidered in bribery scandals during the union drives in Germany, and how the French government arrested 10 McDonald managers for violating labor laws and trade union rights. What are the possibilities for organizing fast food workers and other workers from part-time sectors?
Well, you know, in many ways, this is how I kind of got interested in this issue. I've covered union drives as a journalist at Walmart, McDonald's, Starbucks, Borders, and there have been there's no doubt that there are these pockets of resistance in the McWork sector. And I, at various points, have felt more hopeful, to be perfectly honest with you, about the possibility of organizing the service sector. I believe that there's I think that the union movement has no choice. It has to find a way to organize the service sector, and particularly the McWork sector, because these are the worst jobs, and it's the mandate of the labor movement to go where the bad jobs are and figure it out. But the truth is that the challenge could not be more difficult. I've seen over and over again, even successful drives, and there are so few successful drives, be undone within a couple of months when there's complete staff turnover, and the entire base of support for the union disappears. And I mean, that's part of what workers are organizing against, is the fact that these jobs are built so that there will be such high turnover. But the fact is there is tremendously high turnover, and you really end up having to reorganize these outlets every year. And even the most progressive unions, and I'm thinking particularly of the Canadian Auto Workers Union in Canada, which has tried very hard to organize Starbucks, and the Teamsters in Canada has organized McDonald's. CAW has organized a McDonald's in BC, and they keep losing. Even when they win, they lose they lose certification within a year. So I'd be interested in hearing from some of the organizers in the room about one interesting idea that I heard a few years ago when I wrote about a story for Ms. Magazine on this, is the idea that rather than going after individual chains, you go after a whole community. You target a town and go after all of, basically organize a community, organize all the workers at the McDonald's, the Burger Kings, the Starbucks, and the Gaps, everyone, all at once, rather than going after the chain, because it doesn't translate through the chain. Organizing one Starbucks doesn't mean you've organized the one down the street, so you have to keep organizing these shops of 11 people over and over and over again. It's really not cost effective. So this is what I've found. I'm sorry I don't have a more kind of hopeful answer.
I wish you could say a few words about something that you describe very movingly in your book, that this is not just a bunch of do-gooder groups in the North saying, oh, these are terrible conditions over there. This is a movement of sweatshop workers in these countries that are fighting these contractors for these major corporations, and we're just sort of the transmission belt, you know, that groups in the North are in an information loop, and that's really the exciting thing about it to me, is that this information is being passed on. But I'd like to say a few words about what you saw in Cavite and in Indonesia, working with the workers there.
Yeah. Well, one of the most striking things that, I mean, I mentioned that I'm heartened by the fact that the student movement here has rejected codes of conduct, because, or corporate codes of conduct in particular, because when I spent a lot of time with a group called the Workers Assistance Center, which is trying to bring unions to the largest free trade zone in the Philippines, just outside of Manila. And when I was there a couple of years ago, the issue for them was very, very clear. They were trying to bring unions in to these zones. Unions were illegal in the Philippines, but these free trade zones had been created as sort of denationalized enclaves, essentially illegal states within states. Now that seems to me to be a very wonderful opportunity for political organizing. All you're demanding is a country's right to enforce the laws that it already has. These workers have already fought for the right to form unions, but unions were being decertified all over the country because companies were moving into the free trade zones, and you know, inside the zones there are literally signs that say do not listen to union organizers or troublemakers, and there's an unspoken no union, no strike rule within the zones. So what the organizers who I met wanted was just plain backup. Self-determination, the right to form unions, when there were wildcat strikes going on every other week, and they needed support for these specific struggles. And that's that. And in terms of codes of conduct, they were bewildered by the idea that labor organizers in the States and in Europe were writing codes without their input. I mean, literally bewildered and furious, quite frankly. And what they said to me was, you know, they were willing to wait to get, even if it meant not getting as good rules on paper, they were willing to take less, to take sort of smaller concessions that they had won themselves at the bargaining table than be handed a piece of paper that had been negotiated without their input.
What have some of the corporations you've written about, what's their response been to you?
She gets free Nike shoes.
It really depends on the corporation. I mean, I think that one thing that has changed, and I believe that the McLeibel trial was an enormously educational process for the corporate world as a whole. You know, it started off with this pamphlet that London Greenpeace was distributing, blaming McDonald's for poverty in the third world, for lowering the wages in the catering industry, for litter, for rainforest depletion. I mean everything, right? They're handing out this leaflet. They got 200 copies out in the late 80s, and then McDonald's decided to sue them. It's been translated into 26 languages, and millions and millions of copies of this thing have been downloaded from the internet. So, and in fact, I've heard anti-Nike campaigners say to me that they wish that Nike would sue them because part of the issue here, key demand, is transparency, is disclosure. And right now, we don't have a legal basis to make that demand. But once a company is stupid enough to end up in court with some very tenacious activists, then all of that drops away, of course, because the courts enforce a transparency. So what I find is that most of the large corporations are too smart to try to sue you. That's what I found. Of course, everything in my book is true, so what could they possibly sue me over? But there's plenty of precedent for suing people for things that are true, just because you think they're going to back down. And I think that companies like Nike and Monsanto have learned the lesson of McLeibel, and they don't want that to happen. So what I'm struggling against is actually just co-optation. It's, you know, getting like wonderful calls from Nike's new president of corporate responsibility wanting to do a conference call to, you know, just sort of like how you kind of get love bombed by them. And this has happened to me from a few different corporations. And, you know, the anti-corporate activism is going to be the new niche market. This is the cover of Benetton's magazine Colors this month is a Mickey Mouse ears in blood. And they literally talk about malls as the new concentration camps. I mean, this is Colors magazine, right? So the corporate sector has, and Reebok has its human rights awards. There's all kinds of sort of niche marketing going on. I personally am not worried about it at all because I think that, one of the main points I'm trying to make is that particularly young people are responding to feelings of being over-marketed to, are responding to the cool hunt itself, is sort of the root of much of this backlash. So when the cool hunt comes and even tries to co-opt that, I think it actually radicalizes the opposition. So I hope that sort of answers the question. Question right there. Sir?
I have a notion that consumption in this country anyway is largely a mindless business. I'll come back to that with a little illustration from my own life today. And that production is kind of mindless too. I'd reference for that William Greider's book on the global economy as a kind of mindless process. Nobody's responsible for what's going on. Instant trading in billions of dollars by people who really are not aware or concerned, or can they be, with the consequences. I bought a shirt for $7 last weekend and put it on this morning. It had a brand on it. So I decided to take a scissors to the brand took it off, and now I have a gaping hole in the shirt. But I bought it because it was $7. And what I'm really interested in, since so much of this is mindless, the consumption like mine and the production itself, so you put pins in the overinflated balloons and they're gone, let's say. But the mindless production and the mindless consumption goes on. So what is your prescription really to deal with this giant amorphous thing called globalism?
Well, first of all, I don't think that I'm responding to globalism. I think that, if anything, I'm responding to corporatism. But because I think that part of what we're up against is the total conflation of globalization with corporatization. And what we need to do is try to reimagine a kind of globalization that is different from the one that we have right now. Because I think that there are a lot of people who are in fact for globalization and taken with the promise of globalization that has not been fulfilled. In terms of the rest of your question, it's a very difficult one. I think that these brands are playing a very powerful surrogate role in all of our lives. The issue is not, being a mindless consumer. The issue is allowing this branding process to be effective because we are so hungry for meaning that we look to it, we're even willing to take it from our sneakers and lattes. And so I think that the way to deal with it is not to sort of, try to deal with it directly, like, you're stupid for thinking you're going to get spiritual enlightenment from your sneakers. What's wrong with you? But actually trying to look at the holes in our culture, in the way in which we're failing in the public sphere, and in a sense, I think that then branding, which I think has a role in any market economy, in any economy. It falls into a much more appropriate place. The issue is that it is so inflated that it's replaced all of these other sectors, and so it has to somehow be brought into check. The reason why I am heartened by what we're seeing with student organizing is that I actually think that one of the ways to replace this obsession with branding is to become politically engaged as citizens, to see oneself as a citizen as well as a shopper. So in a way, you kill two birds with one stone. People become politically engaged as citizens, and then they probably care a little bit less about the logos they're wearing at the same time, because part of what these logos are selling us, I mean, in the case of Benetton and Starbucks, is in fact a pseudo-political movement. I mean, that's what Nike's doing when it sells these feminist ads, and it's essentially packaging our most cherished values and ideas as brand extensions.
Yes, I'd like you to talk a little bit more about the potential social base for sort of a larger mobilization against this kind of new economy, sort of building on Seattle, but you seem to be optimistic about the potential for that, and I don't think it's an accident that you've come back to the student population, and I think that there's a reason for that, and that students are still living within communities and are taking part, sharing in some kind of a common experience from which they can be mobilized and mobilize each other to take on this cause. And what worries me, and I guess the reason why I'm less optimistic, is that I think that one of the outcomes of the new economy is to really fragment people. They're not members of unions. They're not staying with jobs. They're part-time workers without, a sort of ongoing identification with a consistent group of other workers. There's so many ways that and you've outlined many of them, that people are really isolated as consumers, workers, and so forth. That when you think about the history of mobilization and what it takes to get people to really act together, I don't know that we have the ingredients for that.
Well, and I think it comes back to the earlier question about organizing the MIC work sector as well, the service sector workers, because of course this is about the fact that in many ways that schools are our only, it's the only vestige of sort of full-time civic life, and that unions are not stepping into that role. So I think that it's all the more reason why we need to sort of solve this problem of how to organize this massive sector in the economy, because that is one way to continue into, you know, post-university into our so-called real lives. The other thing is that I think unions need to, American unions, I've been so impressed by the success of Union Summer, I have to say, because even though I know it's been a really controversial project, I've interviewed dozens and dozens of students involved in anti-corporate activism of various kinds. And I've asked them over and over again, you know, how did this start? How did you get involved? And so many of them said, Union Summer. I interned at Unite one summer, and, you know, next thing I knew, I was, you know, running the guest campaign at Yale or this or that. And but really, I've heard it over and over again. So, I mean, this is a really forward-looking project of you know, building activists that I think are going to continue on after university as well. I do understand why it seems like I'm being overly optimistic, and that is why I'm concentrating on the campuses, because I think that tremendous change can come from there. But I do think that unions, the American unions, have changed dramatically, not enough, moving away from protectionism to taking a more global outlook, which is allowing for this, which is allowing for these bridges to be created between the student movement, between the environmental movement, all of that. And I think in many ways, what's really great about these anti-corporate campaigns, I quote a British campaigner named John Jordan, who was involved in the anti-Seattle protests. And he says, you know, what's great about these multinationals is they've helped us to see this system as interrelated, that there's a connection. If you look at a brand like Shell, environmental concerns, labor concerns, human rights concerns, you know, through this one lens. And that's why I think they are helpful, because they do build between social movements, and so I would look to there for hope as well.
Yeah. Just thinking through your talk, I kind of see this trend in which it started out, companies created a product, and the product started to sell, then it didn't sell as much, then they needed to create a need, so they began marketing, and that worked for a while. Then they needed to create an image, then they created branding. And I'm wondering, in your opinion, what do you think is next?
See, I'm not sure if there is a next. This is the thing. I mean, I know there's always supposed to be a next, but it's the next big thing. I mean, this is what I've been coming to with, you know, okay, brands have always been able to sort of co-opt their opposition and just reinvent themselves into something new, as you say. But I sometimes really get the feeling that, particularly with this co-opting of anti-corporatism, that they're actually following their target market off a cliff, that there is nowhere to go and because we've seen marketing absorb every type of content critique possible, whether it's feminism or subliminal advertising or racism, everything. Advertising can absorb any critique that is leveled at the mechanics of advertising. But I'm not sure it can absorb a critique against the fact of advertising. I don't really see how you do that. I could be missing some trick.
Yeah, I want to make a comment on that, because there is a next, I think.
Okay.
I've talked to people who are planning this next.
Okay.
And it clearly involves with all the information you're going to have on people on the internet. So when you want to buy your sneakers, I don't even have to tell you it's a Nike. It's your personal thing, and I can with enough information, I can sort of have exactly what you want. You want it with a union label on it, give it to you. You want it with a radical slogan on it, I give it to you personally. You see a little bit of this in the Amazon.com. You go on the site, and they know what the previous books you bought are,
yeah.
And they offer you some other things. So, and my sense of talking with advertisers is, what they think is the ultimate thing is where they will have enough information on every person. I don't think this is necessarily bad, but where rather than giving you any mass piece of information,
yeah.
the product is exactly what you want. And then that would be the next to this. And
yeah.
that would make it very hard. because the label wouldn't matter anymore. It's your personal, thing. They know your size, they know what you like, and here's what we have exactly suited for you.
So mutual funds now. You have socially responsible ones, all under the same umbrella. You want socially responsible mutual fund, we'll give you that. And we have other ones over here that aren't so socially responsible.
So an example of that would be at the CKNY perfume that's non-branded. There is no image, it's a non-image image. And that's what they target. Interesting.
I haven't seen it.
Odorless.
I hope it's expensive. Sorry.
Well, I have a question, but I also want to just comment on this, that one group of individuals who work through I think the Now Foundation, were trying to get at how you encourage the public to think more critically about advertising as an entity. And one way that they came upon thinking about this is to look at the ways advertising harms health. And they picked tobacco, alcohol, and fashion industry advertising, and they looked at how it harms women's health, and particularly young women, and they produced this little video, Redefining Liberation, which I've used a bit with mostly high school and college-age women and young men as well. And I think it has been an effective tool, just sparking what is usually a given for most people in this country. That advertising's great, that's how you find out about things. There's very little reflection upon how it can hurt you or be bad for you. And this creates a wedge into that sort of given and assumption, and I think it's done some good things, this kind of thinking, and encouraging the viewer to be a critical thinker and to realize that you get manipulated in all kinds of ways. Now, they're always one step ahead, and I know Brown and Williamson has this fabulous ditty, if you call up their number, and they sing about the tobacco plant, how it's bad for you, and if you're under a certain age, and it's so clever, it sucks you in very, very effectively. And they also produce things that look so wonderful that you don't even know what's inside. So doctors are now putting out in their offices these great things on simple living for women that all have tobacco advertising inside, and they don't even know it because they haven't looked beyond the table of contents and the cover. I'm actually encouraged since WTO and Seattle because I found so many college-age students who weren't in it because they were going to succeed. In fact, most of them were quite sophisticated enough to realize that we probably won't succeed at most of these efforts. But there's such a thing as damage control. Things would be worse were it not for you to be in the fight, so to speak. And I think there were a lot of students who were in it because it was the right thing to do, and they weren't fixated on, well, it's not worth trying because I won't succeed, which is what I used to hear all the time. And that encouraged me. And there was a sense of joy about it too. I mean, I thought about what happened to Candices. Was it yesterday when he gave his exit speech at the IMF? Somebody went up, got in through security, and put the fruit pie in his face right before he was to give his talk. And that kind of thing will make the news, whereas a reasoned critique won't. And then somebody who doesn't even know what the IMF is might even find out a little bit more about it. And that to me was the, these things morph. If GATT goes into WTO, and there was the Trilateral Commission, and there were shadow governments, and everything is the same sort of misuse of power by a few elites who want to maintain their control. And so they latch onto new ways of sort of distracting us. But the thing that excited me about WTO is that I felt like there was a group of people ready for a long haul. Now, I don't know whether that will happen, but that felt committed and creative, and were interested in creating community, and to see the sea turtle advocates with the steel workers, with the representatives for faith-based communities, and the kind of representation which didn't come across in the media, and I actually felt like they had to go a long way to hide that fact because it was so visible. It does lend itself to believing in conspiracies among the media folks, but it's another issue.
Oh, sorry, you're...
Just a couple of brand anecdotes and then a comment. I went in, because there's sometimes I feel like there's no place else to, every once in a while I need to buy something, clothes or something, because I don't make them myself, and I look around for a place to go buy a pair of pants. So, well, all right, so there's a Gap store in Harvard Square, which is sort of like the place I think of as the place where I can go get a pair of pants. I was in there the other day, and I was looking at the exact same pair of pants, and one was made in the Dominican Republic, one was made in Honduras, and the exact same style. And they were made in 3 different countries: Honduras, the Dominican Republic, I forget, maybe Taiwan. Which raised for me one interesting side question is, are they paying everybody in each of these countries the same? Probably not. Are the working conditions the same? The benefits the same? The cost of production the same? And that was just an interesting little experience. Second thing, my nephew was given to my kind of, well, not hard, but I was a little bit disappointed. He was given one of these black, I did like the fact that it was a black hooded sweatshirt, but it was a Nike black hooded sweatshirt for Christmas. And what I was, so I was a little surprised, and I didn't say anything. And then the next day he showed up and he had taken a black magic marker, not because anybody had said anything to him, and he blackened out the Nike symbol. And I was like, wow, where did he get that? And he kind of showed it to me kind of like quietly, like as if he was kind of proud, or he wanted to share it with me. And I was kind of touched by that and encouraged that there was like this undercurrent from high school kids in New Jersey. You know, I don't spend a lot of time with that, you know, my brother and his kids, but there's this like current of rejection of this kind of thing. And then his Christmas present to me was When Corporations Rule the World, this book by David Gorton. And I'd heard of it, and I hadn't, you know, how did he know about this book? It was like it was really kind of a trip. My comment is about this, taking an example of something like Starbucks. Starbucks is something that people can relate to, not just as a corporate brand or all the stuff about the coffee, but in terms of what happens in your, and I mean, you may have spoken about this, what happens not in where the coffee's grown. I mean, Starbucks made a deal with coffee organic, defined as organic coffee growers in East Timor. It was written about in the Wall Street Journal. I don't think it's going to save Starbucks, but people here see what happens when there's a small, locally owned neighborhood coffee shop, and they see the Starbucks open up next door, and that ends up being an enormous impact, negative impact for people that arouses a different kind of opposition to Starbucks. So there's an opportunity for coalition building across different reasons for challenging the corporations behind the corporate brands.
No, it's a great example, and there's of sort of how these brands do bring people together. I've seen Starbucks, people concerned about losing a community artist-run cafe, joining with students who were trying to bring a union to their Starbucks coffee shop, joining with campaigners who were trying to highlight issues around where the coffee was being picked and by whom in Guatemala. So sort of, it's the global economy in miniature, and it's not going to get you very far if that's where it ends, and it ends up being like a competing brand versus brand. But as a popular education tool, you couldn't ask for anything better, as long as you know how to take it to the next step.
I'm a Canadian trade unionist. I'm encouraged too. There's at least 5 or 6 of us that we seem almost buoyant. I worked for a long time with Canadian trade unions and others on the anti-MAI. And then I spent about a year working with international trade unions, labor people, trying to get some consistent position across many labor movements, across many cultures and many countries. And I was encouraged because, in fact, I think we came very close to it. And for me, I saw more unanimity in terms of definition of problem and proposed solutions to globalization that I've seen in over a decade or 15 years in labor. So that encourages me. The other thing that encouraged me in Seattle was the young people, and I want to go back to this point that you made earlier on. The people that we were working with, that I was meeting and talking to, it was almost visceral in the sense, it was as if the corporate, from their standpoint, many of the corporations have just got a bit too much over the top, as it were. And that's what really fascinates me when you talk about branding back. That really interests me because as a trade unionist being involved in boycotts, consumer boycotts, we ran a consumer boycott of Sony products in Canada prior to Christmas. You can imagine what kind of a dent it had on sales.
You did, really? Yeah.
You know? The movement, the labor movement was trying to run a boycott. But what I find interesting and what I would appreciate you commenting on is this distinction between consumer boycotts and this visceral sort of branding back, where you've got people that are 16, 17, 18, 20 that are just saying, hey, I've had it up to here. Basta. Enough already. I've had enough of your stuff, right? Yeah? Can you talk a bit about that sense of branding back and that sort of visceral reaction that it seems is growing?
It's absolutely true, and The Economist magazine, right after Seattle and its ongoing campaign to attack the protesters, talked about what hypocrites these students were. Here they were sucking back their designer lattes and wearing, probably made in China running shoes, complaining about trade. And this was, of course, supposed to make the campaigners look very stupid that they had allowed these inconsistencies to take place. And I think that speaks to the fact that, as you say, this is not consumer. This is really, although there is often a consumer element, I actually think that the greatest danger is that it will just degenerate into lifestyle politics, much as the environmental movement in the 80s did, and it'll just become about, is your laundry detergent green or not? Are your shoes no sweat? I mean, it is possible. I joked about it, but it is possible for this to degenerate into niche marketing, and I think the reason why it isn't is because it comes from a more visceral place than that. And I think the best example of that is I sort of first started noticing this anti-corporate activism through the rise of culture jamming, ad busting, ad parroting, which is happening more and more because of access to new to information technologies, which allows you to download an ad off the internet and have the original and mess with it on your desktop and have it look really slick and have it look exactly like that Gap campaign and repost it to your friends and put it up if you like. Where I first started seeing that was on university campuses where there were ads had started appearing in washrooms, above urinals and in bathroom stalls, which was the stupidest thing if you think about it. If you think about the psychology, that's why I say sometimes it feels like brands follow their target market off of a cliff. Because here you are branding, putting an ad in a washroom in a university campus, which is a space for so long has been a safe space for self-expression, let's just say, right? I mean, this is where students take out their magic markers and say what they actually think, their eyeliners and stuff. And so for the first time, it just crossed a line, and all of these students whose own parents, whose own educators had been saying, you know what, they're so branded, what does it matter if we just put in another ad? I mean, that's what they say to themselves when they sign the deal that there's going to be, ads in washrooms. They say, not this is a good idea, but who really cares? Because these kids are bombarded from day one. It's not, another ad is not going to matter. But what was interesting is that it did matter. There was this sort of visceral kind of uprising, and in fact, the ads were under such attack on many university campuses that they yanked them because it was not cost-effective at all. And yeah, in terms of branding back, as I said, I believe that Nike, the reason why the Nike campaign has been so tenacious, and I think that we cannot underestimate the power of this. Nike has been under the microscope for over 5 years. 5 years? 10 years? Well, 5 years, big time in the public eye. Grassroots campaigning before that. Now, since when can a company just, have 5 people, say, on staff full-time dealing with an issue, put out PR spin after PR spin, in fact, change their practices in several ways and have it not matter? We're talking about a culture where there was, the Exxon Valdez spill, and a couple weeks later it was like, all right, what's next, right? But the Nike campaign has legs, and it has legs because there's a part of us, and I think particularly for young people who aren't buying it, and who, the more corporations respond with spin, the more distrust there is, because it comes from this feeling of being being over-marketed to. So I actually believe that there's a part of the culture that does not want the Nike campaign to go away, that actually wants it to just hang around, and so that they can watch the company squirm. And there's no precedent for dealing with this type of activism, because it isn't just about boycotts and it isn't just about consumer activism. It's about rage. That's what Microsoft is about as well. It's about, you know, I mean, it started in the hacker community, where, you know, Microsoft was sort of branded as the evil empire, and it spread to the broader culture with, you know, Bill Gates' wealth pages. And so just this sort of visceral reaction that there's just something wrong here, this person is too rich, you know, it's just, you know, it's not trickling down. You know, there has to be a place where it stops. And it's really, companies are having a lot of trouble controlling this, because it is emotional. It's not just something that you can solve right away.
Just a softball question. I happen to notice that this is the Canadian version of your book. Mm-hmm. This is the U.S. version of your book.
Which one do you like better?
What's going on with the branding here? Well, my Canadian heritage likes this one. My U.S. obviously prefers this one. But what's going on with your publisher here?
Well, there's two different publishers for each market.
On the same page, they do have Bill Gates eating a pie.
Yes, it's the exact same inside. Well, this black edition is the same in Canada and the UK. And you Americans, you can tell me if it's true. They said that the Americans, you know, they needed POW. It's America, you know, we need to, you can't just have a stark black cover. So I said, okay. And so we did this parody of a Baby Gap ad. I like them both. It's sort of like writing two books for the price of one. So I'm just happy about that.
Your expression a while ago about love bombs was an interesting. I never heard that before. It's a nice concept. I think, and this is sort of connected to. Today. Pardon me? Oh, that's Valentine's Day. Love bombs at Harvard University. But I remember reading, I think, relatively recently, that Global Exchange, which is I think widely thought of as a fairly progressive group that's been involved in putting pressure on Nike and so forth, was getting a lot of heat from people on the left, and perhaps appropriately, for kind of, I don't know, going on one of the trips with Nike people and being there when Nike raised the wage, and then they went back and put out this publicity that said, well, Nike has been a good boy, and then the left landed on them.
Yeah.
And so it's a question of, like, you know, what's a credible place to stand when you've got love bombs going at you, when they start doing the right thing. You know, what's the, you know, where are the plateaus or whatever? I mean, because this is obviously, seems to me, a long-term campaign of some resistance and cultural change. And there will be love bombs. They will do the right thing on occasion, but they need to be recognized for that, but on the other hand, it's not enough.
Yeah.
So, I mean, how do you handle that sort of slippery slope, so to speak?
Well, I think that groups get into that kind of trouble when they start negotiating on behalf of workers who they shouldn't be negotiating on behalf of in the first place. And I mean, that wasn't up to Global Exchange to decide when Nike had done enough, because, as Jeff pointed out, these campaigns start with workers in Indonesia and the Philippines and China organizing wildcat strikes and making demands, losing their jobs and so on. They'll say when Nike's okay. Nike will be okay when they're at the bargaining table. And I think that a lot of groups, and I respect the work of Global Exchange, I think they've done some amazing stuff, but I think that the response of the corporations has, just in the past 2 years, has actually surprised a lot of NGOs, because they weren't ready for it, because it has been so dramatic. You know, going from denial that there was a problem to, you know, name calling you bunch of fringe groups, really direct vilification of Global Exchange by Nike specifically, to, okay, let's sit down together and write the rules. Oh, you think, this is your study? You think that there should be a raise? Okay, well, we'll raise workers' wages 6%, which is what happened. And I think that was such a dramatic shift that that it kind of blindsided some of these groups, and I believe that they lost perspective for who they were fighting for, what they were fighting for. What they were fighting for was self-determination for workers who were beginning to organize themselves and needed backup, not to decide themselves in San Francisco when Nike had done enough. Sorry,
the comment I sort of had, I haven't read your book, I don't know if you talk about this, but I think that a real problem, when you talk about groups that speak for workers, what happened in the case of child labor is a real example of what happened when people here decided to speak for children there. In the case of Bangladesh, which is where I'm from, there was agitation about child labor, and the Harkins Bill came into play. And what happened in Bangladesh was that a lot of children were pushed out of the garment industry, and they started working in, UNICEF said they started working in high rates of child prostitution, they started doing welding. And despite repeated attempts by a lot of labor activists in Bangladesh to tell activist groups here that children should still be continued to allowed to work, but with regulations, there was just this sort of like, we've decided that child labor is not good, therefore we're not going to let it allow it to exist in any case. And there was a meeting between the Bangladesh Government of Manufacturers Association and USAID where they were trying to have a deal where they would pay workers to, at least for half the day, go to school. But USAID said we cannot have any involvement whatsoever with anything to do with child labor because of what the US public is demanding. And I think that's like an example of why we really have to be careful about when, when the groups here speak for groups there, and when it really is a valid voice.
And I think we'll probably have to end there, but it is really about changing the culture, because I think that part of the problem is that we are such a consumer-based culture that we actually want quick service for our grievances, right? It's like, we have found a problem and we would like a solution tomorrow. And that's, I think, how these no sweat and labels start seeming like viable solutions, and bills with no consultation start seeming like they're viable solutions. And so I think that what you said about being heartened by the fact that you're meeting young people who are saying we're in it for the long haul, we don't actually expect to get results tomorrow, I think is really heartening, because that's the most important shift, is to get out of this sort of consumer mindset when it comes to political activism. Thank you all for coming. Brand idea, becoming real-world incarnations of their myth. The brand is the cultural infrastructure. The culture is brand content. Now, of course, within this new culture, a kind of global claustrophobia sets in for many people. Cool hunting, of course, is a form of legalized mass stalking. Students are enlisted as self-marketers more and more. They are given disposable cameras and journals to keep track of their friends' haircuts and so on, and the latest lingo to sell it to the brand masters. What this means is that there's no gestation period for new scenes, for new ideas. And I think as a young person, you're faced with a couple of choices. One is that you can turn yourself into a commodity, become what Tom Peters calls a brand called you, a professional consumer, and sell that information at a premium to your corporate clients. Or you can do something else. You can begin to run in the other direction. I said that branding is about transcending products. But what does that really mean? It means that products, more specifically, the people who produce those products, have just gotten a very major demotion in the economic hierarchy. Because in this equation, products are banal, whereas branding is what is exciting. But branding is an enormously expensive enterprise, getting more expensive every day. The money needs to be saved somewhere to fuel these ambitious corporate utopias, the Nike Towns, the Roots Lodges, the Swatch Times. Where it's being saved is in the act of production. Companies that used to be satisfied with 100% markup from what it cost to produce their product to what they would sell it at retail are now not settling for nothing less than 400%. The idea is that you can let someone else produce your product, and you will buy the product, source them like a raw commodity. Better yet, get lots of other people to produce your products and have them compete against each other over who can give you the best price. After all, what you produce is not the product, but the image, the brand. This is the Nike paradigm. Don't own a single factory, and let a web of contractors and subcontractors around the world fall over each other to offer to make your shoes at the cheapest price. The reason why Nike is so significant is because they have spawned armies of copycats. Levi Strauss laid off 13,000 workers in the past 3 years. But when they laid off those workers, it was reported in the news as if, once again, some American factories closed. They moved to Mexico, they moved to China. McDonald's, The Gap, Levi's, Starbucks. I believe that behind the protests outside of Nike Town, behind the pie in Bill Gates' face, behind the bottle shattering at those McDonald's windows in Seattle, and even behind the attacks on those e-commerce sites on the internet, there is something too visceral for most conventional measures to track, a kind of bad mood rising against the global brands. The windows that shattered in Seattle weren't just any windows. They were symbolic windows, windows opening onto the new economy. That was what was under attack. And behind the shattering glass, we are also seeing the beginnings of a new agenda. The need for enforceable regulations governing labor, environmental, and human rights standards in the global economy. The need to rein in corporate power on the global level so that corporations are ruled by citizens rather than the other way around. The questions I want to answer today is why now? Because, of course, labor, environmental, and human rights violations are not new. Why then are they drawing people to the streets in the thousands all of a sudden? The answer has to do with an ideology that has gripped the corporate world over the past 15 years and has sent it into euphoric convulsions in the age of e-commerce. That is the idea that in order to be a successful multinational corporations, you need to produce brands, not products. The idea is that anyone can produce a product in the global economy. And look at what happened to IBM when it almost went under in the late 80s. Competing based on value is a loser's game, they say. The market was flooded with identical PCs, and IBM did not have a strong enough brand to compete. Of course, we know today that IBM has reincarnated itself into being about solutions, no longer about these clunky machines. It is about the global economy itself. In this context of hostility towards products, the brand has evolved from a mark of quality on a product to a badge of courage for the consumer. Nike is the most popular tattoo in North America, the Nike swoosh, that is. In this corporate formula, the brand has little to do with the product. Rather, it is a freestanding idea. The goal of the successful brand has become nothing short of transcendence from the world of things. So we've had these series of corporate epiphanies in the past 15 years. Nike, we are told, is no longer a shoe company, it is a sports company. It is about the idea of transcendence through sports. Starbucks, we are told, is not a coffee company. It is a community company. Diesel is about creating a movement. Microsoft, that is about an idea, not a product, becomes real through sponsorship of cultural events, by launching its own lifestyle magazine in the case of Starbucks, or a line of furniture in the case of Ernest Hemingway, by building palatial superstores in the case of everyone, through new and exciting brand extensions. If you think of the brand as a balloon with nothing much at the center, because of course the product has magically disappeared, this process of absorbing cultural space is how it staves off its own deflation. Everything is a tableau for the brand, and the brand needs to write on these surfaces in order to exist. Advertising agencies have started to think of themselves not as marketers, but as brand factories. In fact, there is an advertising firm in my hometown of Toronto that is called the Brand Factories. And in fact, this is the true production of our information economy. We've seen the rise of the cool hunting industry, which didn't exist before 1993 and is now a ballooning industry. The role of this industry is to comb our culture, comb the back alleys, our schools, our playing fields, and find content for the brands to make them real. Find precious ideas, heroes, political movements, and sell them back to the brands. I want to stress that this process is not about advertising. It is about production. The goal is no longer association, but merger with the culture. Advertising used to be about associating a product with a particular lifestyle, with a particular aspirational quality, such as beauty. What we're seeing now are 3D ads that are so all-encompassing, they cease to be advertisements at all and become our culture. Nike, for instance, once it decided that it was about sports, was not satisfied with simply attaching its name to sporting events. It has started buying sporting events outright. Roots, a Canadian company which has the brand meaning of summer camp, the Canadian wilderness, has built a summer camp, a branded summer camp, which you can visit for any length of time, and where you are completely cocooned in the Roots brand. Everything is owned by Roots. Mentos used to try to associate itself with rock music. It now owns the Mentos Freshmaker Tour. Swatch, whose brand is time, not watches, has launched its own time. It's called Internet Time, and it's branded time, and it divides the day into Swatch beats. Benetton, of course, has become a campaigner for death row inmates. It is about a political movement. The goal of branding is seamless integration with their brand. It is not about software, it is about communication. The product becomes a medium to express the brand's idea, and it is one medium among many, like a billboard. And as we know, as these companies have transcended, they have in many cases stopped producing their own products entirely. And there's been an interesting parallel with other brands, the rise of celebrity super brands. As corporations like Nike and Starbucks have occupied the role of celebrities in our culture, the celebrities in our culture are increasingly envisioning themselves as corporations, as brands. So we have the Martha Stewarts, the Michael Jordans, the Jerry Seinfelds. But what's really interesting is that increasingly, just as Nike has stopped producing its own sneakers, many of these super branded humans have also begun to separate themselves from anything that could broadly be described as doing things. We have Michael Jordan, who has transcended the need to play basketball, just as Nike has transcended the need to make running shoes. And he has become a pure brand. He is about the Jordan attitude, and in fact has become the first celebrity endorser to have his own celebrity endorsers. We have Wayne Gretzky, very similar, stopped playing hockey so that he can be a full-time brand. Jerry Seinfeld gave up the sitcom, why bother? And what's really interesting is, of course, we know that the true celebrities of our branded era are not the basketball stars or the running shoes, but the CEOs themselves. And I was very interested to learn that Bill Gates had stepped down as CEO of Microsoft. He too has transcended to become pure brand. He is pure Bill. Of course, the end result of this type of branding economy is seen not in the corporeal world of things, but online, in the IPOs, the Netscapes and Amazon.coms. The ultimate transcendence is, of course, occurring on the internet. These companies exist as ideas of themselves, free from products entirely. It's tempting to dismiss branding mania as a flavor of the week, just a little bit more management babble. What I'm arguing here is that this seemingly innocuous idea has had two major effects on our culture, transformative effects, which taken together explain the rise of anti-corporate activism that we saw in Seattle. And these two effects I'll separate into two categories: no space and no jobs. The brand needs to express its idea. How does it do that? It needs to project itself onto as many surfaces as possible. That is how a company...
To our Labor and Work-Life Forum, I hope you did not wear your Nike shoes. Maybe you did or did not buy a Barbie doll recently, and you were careful in what you were drinking last night as you were having your dinner. I wore a Canadian-made jacket, which I assume was made by good labor, and American-made shoes, but I didn't quite check my T-shirt and my underwear, so I don't know. But today, we're going to have a Naomi Klein, who's the author of this book, No Logo, which is about the corporate global branding and all the various things we can or cannot do and the things that are being done to make sure that if we're buying Nike, they really are good guys rather than bad guys. I assume Alfred Knopf and Company is a good guy, so they're bringing out this book. She's also just recently had a piece in the New York Times expressing sympathy with a bunch of anti-WTO protests in Seattle, which will be counter to everything you've heard from all the economists in the group, and therefore is probably will please you no end. Naomi, the floor is yours, or the podium is yours.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Elaine Bernard and Jack Trumper and Jeff Ballinger, who are all responsible for inviting me here today. It's a great honor. A couple of months ago, I got an email from someone who I just met, and he said, you know, when you told me that you had just written a book about anti-corporate activism, I was only pretending to know what on earth you were talking about. Then I went home and I turned on the television set and saw what was going on in Seattle, and I realized what you were talking about. At the time, critics accused the anti-WTO protesters in Seattle of ignorance, of coming together in a jumble of unrelated slogans that degenerated into petty vandalism. What I want to argue today is that that's not true at all, that there was a common cause in Seattle, and that was that the multinational corporation has been identified as the root cause of the degradation of labor standards, human rights, and environmental standards. Even when the protests degenerated into rioting, the targets of their rage were still coherent, if crudely expressed.